Hello, folks.
Hello, folks, and welcome to Totally Tank, the tankiest podcast in Tankville. Let's get this new technology going.
And I'm John. So this is Rob. He didn't say his name. This is episode 71. We are recording and streaming live on 14 June 2025. So the President's Day birthday parade is about to start in the US, and quite a lot's happening in Iran, between Iran and Israel. But we are here to talk about the Matilda II. Just quickly, we have some people on the line because we're streaming live to record this. Brandon Make Stuff is coming in from Seattle-ish. Alexander Vlad has joined us, and he thinks the US should have a military parade, but she made it up entirely of M10 bookers. That would be a short parade. Hans Vornhat has joined us from Boston. He's been crushing Guinnesses since 6, and it's amazing he's still here. We agree. Good work.
On you, Hans.
Okay, thank you, Hans. Alan is here, and he says, but only because it worked when the Brits were alone. I think that's one of the GOAT's votes. So we have a poll going. The options are the Matilda II was British crap or one of the GOATs. So if you haven't already, please head over to totallytank.net and sign up for the email list or the RSS feed so we can let you know about updates without having to beg permission from the fascist oligarchs who own social media. Because you know what we don't like, Rob?
Fascists.
Fascists. We've been accused of anti-fascist bias this month, Rob.
I know.
It's very sad and shocking. And we say, yeah, we don't like fascists. Kill them all. Anyway. If you like the show, then for God's sake, smash those like and subscribe buttons on whatever platform you're on, and leave positive reviews wherever possible, because they do really help. And quickly again, before we get stuck into Matilda II, which we've got a lot to say about, a big shout out to our newest patron. Actually, someone else has come on since then, Steve. Thank you, Steve. But Callum, who actually owns a tortoise, which is called Matilda, because we did describe Matilda as the tortoise of war in the show notes. Okay, other stuff.
Tasman's joined us.
Yes, Tasman is with us, and Alexander Vlad wants more options in the poll. Well, tough. You're not getting him. Just deal with it.
All right, so some of you may have noticed that Totally Tanked already has an episode on the Matilda II. In fact, it's the first episode. However, I wasn't there, and there wasn't enough beer, so we're doing it again. Actually, it's because the podcast has evolved, and we'd like to revisit it again with a bit more time. We hope you don't mind, and we won't be revisiting every early episode, but we may throw in one every couple of months, and eventually we'll talk about the Matilda I, because whilst it shared a name, it was a different beast altogether. The other thing you may notice for those watching the stream is that we're wearing our ACT Brumbies tops for the video in the hopes that the Brumbies will make it through their semi-final game this afternoon against the Waikato Chiefs, being played right after we finish. And at least James Dolman won't be reffing again, as he handed the other final position to the Crusaders last night after doing the same thing to the Brumbies the other week. Meaning we cannot go host the grand final. Not that I'm bitter at all.
So, to our international audience, sorry about that extended grievance about...
I've got axes to grind, and I'm going to grind them because I've got a platform.
About our local rugby competition. Well, it's an international rugby competition, and the no Australian side has ever won a final in New Zealand, and we're hoping we can change that tonight. But I don't have a lot of hope, but I have my jersey on, so and it's a very
I'm wearing my Matilda
jersey.
T-shirt underneath. Just anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, so John, tell me.
Yes.
What is Listen Note, and what does our 2% ranking mean?
Well, we've moved up finally from being one of a top global 2.5% podcast to a top global 2% podcast, and Listen Note is pretty much the only thing that ranks podcasts in a way that the industry agrees has any validity. It's the umpire, they keep score. And that moves us from sharing with a couple of other tank-related podcasts to being the only one in that bracket. And I would say the only thing that makes us the greatest tank-related podcast in the world is
beer.
The beer helps, but it's not the fact that we know more. We definitely don't. It's not that we have better resources. We definitely do not. It's not that we're smarter. We're not. It's that we keep sticking at it. And everyone else who gets into the space does a couple of years and then goes, oh, this is hard, no one's listening, and leaves. So the moral of the story is persist, just like a Matilda II.
And beer.
Mm-hmm.
And now, onto the tank. Her name was the A12 Matilda, or Infantry Mark II, or the Queen of the Desert, or the Infantry Panzer Kampfwagen Mark II 748 brackets E, translating as Infantry Mark II number 748 English.
Because the Germans did use a lot of captured Matildas, because they thought they were quite useful tanks too.
Yes. But why Matilda? The codename Matilda appears on the original sketches of the infantry tank. It could have been named after Queen Matilda, or a toy duck, which supposedly resembles the vehicle's diminutive size and duck-like shape and gait, or from ye olde German, where Matilda means strength in battle. But from wherever it came from, Matilda I and Matilda II were always to be known as the Matilda tank.
Oh, I just want to note, Queen Matilda is a little-known part of British history, but she was a really evil, vengeful bitch who tortured a lot of people.
There you go.
And
as kings do.
Well, as rulers do, but the thing she did to keep old Stephen down in their civil war was, yeah, you wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of that woman. So
I think 12th century, something like that, 1148 or something I saw. But anyway, for anyone who doesn't know much about Australia, we have a very famous song called Waltzing Matilda, written in 1895 by the famous Australian poet Banjo Patterson. It was as a bush ballad. Waltzing Matilda is Australia's unofficial national anthem.
It was very close to becoming the national anthem.
It was for a little while, but it wasn't actually ratified. We were encouraged to use it. And considering we only got an official national anthem in 1984, replacing God Save the King, God Save the Queen, that's pretty significant. So Waltzing Matilda was a way to distinguish Australian forces from the rest of the Commonwealth. And basically, whenever they came on board ships and marching into places, they would play Waltzing Matilda.
And when a marching band plays Waltzing Matilda, you just want to go for a long walk. It lifts your feet. It's a good marching anthem.
Anyway,
yeah.
So the song itself can be overanalyzed to be about state-sponsored violence by the illegitimate ruling class against the people, or it could just be a catchy tune.
But mostly it's about killing a union organiser and then pretending that, he just stole a sheep and killed himself.
Yep, he committed suicide. No, he didn't.
And that is, the State Library of Queensland has that version on its website. This isn't just me making up some conspiracy, people.
No. This has been how it's analysed, because it was after the union. Well, it wasn't even. We didn't even have unions back in the 1890s when it was happening. But the shearers were saying, we're not going to work for these illegitimate bloody squatters who had all the money and power. Anyway, we digress. So it does provide another link to why Australians feel a connection with the Matilda tank. The song is also the official song of the US Marine 1st Division, commemorating the time the unit spent in Australia during the Second World War. And part of the tune is also the British Royal Tank Regiment's Slow March, because the Matilda was slow.
But they did love their Matildas in the Royal Tank Regiment, so yeah, it has a lot of tributes around the place.
Alrighty, stats. Type, infantry tank. To some are heavy, to some are medium, but only ever an infantry tank. In service from 1935 till 1955.
Sorry, 1939 to 1955.
Sorry, 1939 till 1955. So all the way through. Produced from 1937 to 1943. They built almost 3,000, so 2,987. Weighed 25 tonnes, 18 feet 5 inches long, only 8 feet 6 inches wide, and only 8 foot 3 inches tall. So not very tall and not very wide, because it had to fit on the rail gauges.
Now, the next point here is the crew, and it may be another tank did this before Matilda, but it was one of the first to settle on what is now considered a very standard orientation of the crew in the tank. So you had a driver, gunner, loader, commander. You had the gunner, loader, and commander in the turret. You had a basketed turret. It was a long way ahead of its time, and many tanks were built after it that hadn't figured out that this was how tanks should be if you don't have an autoloader.
And sticking with the idea of the loader on the right side of the gun, so that you can handle the ammunition. Oh, hang on. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
But the if you're watching, for those who are on the video feed, we do have some footage of the commander and the gunner getting into the turret one after the other, and they're basically dropping into the same position. The gunner, I hope he really liked all the commanders that they worked with, because they were intimate. This was a very small turret trying to cram 3 people into it, and yeah.
Again, as we have to keep on saying, is that people were smaller after the Great Depression, and because there wasn't as much nutrition. So
but
it was skinnier and smaller.
It was a tight fit, and there was this whole crazy thing where the British Railways were telling them that they couldn't make a turret ring wider than a certain diameter.
54 inches.
Yeah, which, if you actually looked at where were the tank factories, where were the ports they had to get to, they could well have built wider tank rings, and by the time they got to Centurion, they just said, stuff you, were doing it. So it was largely a bureaucratic fiction, because they were being constrained by the width of the narrowest tunnel in the whole of Britain, not by whether they ever actually wanted to go through that tunnel. Yeah.
Armour. The front glasses was up to 78 millimetres thick, with the front slightly thinner but sloped and angled. The sides of the hull were 65 to 70 millimetres, plus the 25 millimetre side skirts, and even the rear armour was 55 millimetres. The turret was 75 millimetres all round, and only the roof of the turret and the engine deck were 20 millimetres, which was still significantly more than most other tanks at the time.
So it was an absolute combat wombat. It was just designed to wade into fire from all around, and until the mid-war period was able to shrug off a lot of damage. And I still want to note that even in 1945, in the jungle warfare it was involved in, it took enormous amounts of damage from all sides because it was a very high priority target on those battlefields, and often either shrugged it off or was back in service within 48 hours.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Right, main arm, we've got our quick-fire 2-pounder, the 40mm gun, with 93 armour-piercing rounds on board, or the 3-inch close support howitzer with 54 rounds being stored on board, being a mix of smoke and HE, the ratio depending on whose tank it was. The Brits had 2-to-1 smoke to HE, the Russians wanted 3-to-1 HE to smoke, and Australians, I think, just wanted about 3-to-1 as well of HE to smoke. Secondary armour, it ended up with the 7.92mm Beezer machine gun, carrying almost 3,000 rounds. However, it did start out with a Vickers 303 machine gun in a certain distinctive armoured cowl. They did have the ability to mount an external Bren gun for anti-air, but it was rarely fitted with them and never used in the jungle, as they caught on vegetation and exposed the commander to any enemy fire at close range. The engine, John, tell us about the engine. 2 diesel, 6-cylinder, 7-litre AC or Leyland engines.
Look, the strength and the weakness of this tank was these pathetic little bus engines that were for tooling around London in double-decker buses that they strapped together on a common drive shaft and did some quite clever work with the gearbox to make it all work. So the power was pathetic, 190 horsepower, but anyone who had serviced a bus could service a Matilda tank, and that meant there was a lot of trained people available. And when you get to the late war period, where Australia could have bought Shermans, but they had aircraft engines in them, they preferred Matilda, where they had lots of people who already knew how to service the engines.
And the gearbox, the pre-selected gearbox, was the same as a double-decker bus as well. So anybody who knew how to drive a bus also knew how to use the pre-selected gearbox. Yeah,
so it was a terrible, crappy engine with nowhere near enough power, and this is why it didn't go very fast and could get in some real predicaments with a lack of reserve power. Having said that, it worked, and 25 kilometres an hour, which was the maximum speed. I don't think they hit that too often. My electric bicycle...
Downhill with the wind behind them.
Yeah. My electric bicycle is limited to 25 kilometres an hour. That's the law here for electric bicycles. But you can get some places at 25 kilometres an hour. It's not enormously fast, but it's not incredibly slow. You do have a weird issue, though, that the whole British Army was fitted out with universal carriers, so the infantry were advancing at quite high speeds. The idea that the tank didn't have to go faster than the infantry wasn't entirely correct unless you had a transporter for the tank. So the infantry tank concept definitely still had some work and has largely been abandoned since. But,
the two engines together weighed 1,000 kilos, which is more than the 500 horsepower Soviet engine weighing 750 kilos. So just think about that. So the Soviets were able to get much more out of their engine at lower weight.
We've got an interview with Peter Samsonov talking about Matildas in Russian service, but when the Matildas arrived for Russian use, and the Russians were, not all of their engines were great, but the KV-2 coming out of the Kharkiv train factory was double overhead cam, alloy block, fuel injected, diesel engine, and they would have been looking at these bus engines of 1930s Britain compared to, the KV-2 was revolutionary and stayed in service until the 1990s with lots of tweaks and development, but the Russians had a much better diesel engine than the British were building. And there's some internal British politics and trying to protect the railways and protecting wealthy people's investments that stuff them on this. But,
All right. Transmission, we had a 6-speed Wilson epicyclic pre-selection gearbox. Doesn't actually have a gear clutch. The way the pre-selector works, you select the gear you want to go into, and when you're ready, you press the pre-selector pedal and it moves into that gear. So you need to know what terrain you're going into or what bends that you're coming up to so you can pre-select the right gear, as there was no reserve power, so you need to get it right.
It's one of those things that if the driver knew what they were doing, no one ever noticed that there was ever an issue. With an incompetent driver, you would quickly get into real trouble. And then the suspension, it gets called bell crank suspension, which is the same thing Japanese suspension gets called. And they all have the Vickers Light tanks as their ancestors, but they are quite different.
Yep. Yeah. So it was all based off the British A7, and it was called also known as Japanese suspension. But yeah, it was just bell crank. Crank suspension.
Yeah.
All right. Fuel capacity: 40 imperial gallons, 34 and 35 imperial gallons external tank, operational range of 50 miles or 98 miles with the auxiliary tank.
Now, let's remember, you're only moving, and we've got these ranges in miles, and I'm thinking in kilometres, but it could basically operate for 10 hours without refuelling, which is extremely good, and the British would go, particularly with Centurion, to tanks that could do fractions of that moving into the future. So those little diesels were at least quite economical. That they had that 10 hours of operation is solid without refueling.
There you go. Maximum speed of 15 miles an hour on the road, or up to 9 miles per hour off road. But speedo went up to 40 miles an hour, so somebody had to be hopeful about that.
Yeah, look, I've owned cars that had 220 on the speedometer, but we won't talk on air about how fast we've gone, but we didn't hit 200, I'll tell you that.
When driving up to Darwin back in the 90s, where the roads there didn't actually have a speed limit, now the speed limits there are 130. So just had bought myself a new car, did manage to crank it up to 200 Ks on a night, because they have nice long straight stretch of road for about 10 Ks and a nice little turn at the end of it, just to keep you awake. And as long as there were no horses or camels on the road, you're pretty set. And
unless you won't get overtaken by a road train at 200 kilometres an hour. So there's that.
Anyway, we got up to that speed and very quickly dropped it back down to about 130. But we just thought we'd try and test it out. Yeah. Anyway, as I said, there were no speed limits on that road back in those days. Design and development. For once, the development of a British tank seemed to be mostly without controversy or ineptitude.
Weirdly, because Viscount Nuffield wasn't sticking his oar into British tanks at this point.
Anyway, in 1934, General Hobart of Hobart's Funnies directed the Ordnance to design a small, heavily armoured machine gun tank and a larger, heavily armoured version with a cannon and a machine gun, which was proof against field artillery of the time. These tanks were there to support infantry, and so only needed to go slightly faster than the infantry. The machine gun version, the A11 Matilda I, was developed first, as no one stuck their hand up to build the cannon version until 1936, when the design of the A12 Matilda II was started.
But let's remember 1930s tank design all over the world. There was still this idea that tanks might be a good idea to have them as mobile pillboxes full of machine guns. And
you wanted them going forward, taking out the trenches by shooting lots of machine guns slowly as your infantry came up alongside you.
Yeah, but it was just because the statistical realisation that high explosive was much more useful than firing bullets into the dirt. But yeah.
Yeah. The A12 Matilda II was started in 1936 based on the layout and design of the A7 medium tank from 1930. A mild steel mock-up of the more heavily armoured A12 was finished in 1937, and two prototypes built in April 1938. Doing well in the springtime tests of 1938, a few adjustments were made to the gearbox, suspension and cooling, but a production order was placed in June 1938. The only real controversy here was that whilst Vickers had made the prototypes, the production contract was given to Vulcan. With everyone reading the writing on the wall that war was coming, the decision was made to cut production of the Matilda I and increase production of the A12 Matilda II. Contracts for more tanks were set out to a number of locomotive companies and production increased. But, however, even after all that, only 2 Matilda IIs were in service when the war started in September of 1939.
So when we say that Matilda was in service from the start of the war to the end of the war, just barely on both ends of the spectrum, but it was very heavily involved in the middle.
Those two count. All right, and whilst Britain did not have the industrial capacity of the USA, it still had a greater production capability than Nazi Germany, not to mention the ability to access raw materials from its colonies. It just took a bit of time for the British craftsmen to get into gear. So they built as many tanks with the heaviest armour, the best anti-tank gun of the time, and installed two of the simplest engines available to power a tank that only had to be slightly faster than walking.
If you forget that the troops were actually all in universal carriers zipping along. They were meant to all be fully mounted. Certainly the British Expeditionary Force into France was 100%, forced.
After...
Yeah, after they lost all the universal carriers,
they didn't have as many.
So, there's things with Matilda. The early models had return rollers for the tracks, and then they just said, you know what, it's not going that fast. Skids will be fine and save us some weight and difficulty.
We're not sneaking up on anybody anyway. The extra clanking of the skids will be fine.
And it's really interesting that the Valentine, it's like, why did they bother with Valentine when there's Matilda? It's like, well, they could build Valentine much more cheaply and faster than they could build Matildas, because they had problems with the casting of the Matilda, and they had to grind out the shapes to lose the weight. And that sort of grinding to not, grind out back through the armour requires a lot of skill, and they lacked the people to do that, and so eventually they just moved it to Valentine, which was a better way to move a 2-pounder gun around. But in terms of the sheer durability of it, they remain very strong, and that's why when Australia said, what tank do we want to take into the South Pacific, we said, now forget the newer Valentines, forget even Shermans, what we want is Matildas.
Even though the Kiwis got the Valentines.
Yeah, well, they couldn't afford the good stuff. We got the good stuff. I just want to note the poll currently has 8 votes, and 100% are currently saying that Matilda II was one of the goats. So greatest of all times.
Right, some notes on the development. Early versions started with a trench crossing tail, but they were removed in favour of an external fuel tank. Very quickly.
It's pretty cool to lose the sissy bar for the fuel tank, but yeah.
All right, it does actually have sloped/angled armour on the hull with a beaky prow. You just can't see it behind the skirts and these storage bins on the front. Cast and rolled armour rather than the bolted armour used on many, or riveted armour used on many other British tanks that came afterwards and before. As John was saying, the beaky prow armour could come out too thick, and to save weight, it would have to be ground down, which would then take more time and an experienced craftsman to do that. So you couldn't just, it made it more complicated, as you were saying. Flat style tracks used on early Matildas meant they couldn't cross wet grass. Now, you'd think a tank would be able to get across a bit of a slope on some wet grass, but
I'd love to be in the room when someone had to say, the tank attack car had to be called off because the tanks couldn't cross the wet grass, sir.
But the tracks they were using in the beginning, they were World War I very flat tracks, and they had no grip whatsoever. And because of this, they failed the spring trials of 1940, and this kept many of the initial Matildas from being deployed to France before the defeat. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Two solutions that were put forward to fix this issue was to raise the track suspension, which actually made things worse, but that's what they went with. And the second solution was to weld spurs onto the tracks, which worked well. So only 26 Matilda IIs made it to France as they mucked about with the suspension. Then after Dunkirk, they spent more time lowering the suspension back down to where it was. The flat tracks were not as much of an issue in the desert, so some were deployed there without changing the tracks to the basically what you'd expect to see on a normal tank, having track pads and or putting spurs on them. Does have a turret basket. Now, we was getting into the controversy of the 40mm HE rounds. Britain had made 11,000 40mm HE rounds that could have been used in the 2-pounder guns prior to 1940, but they weren't deployed with the tanks. They were not seen as very effective, and the tank's role was to take out other tanks. So supposedly all those 11,000 rounds were then given to the artillery manning the towed anti-tank guns, because they thought...
The 2-pounder was a whole family of weapons across the British and imperial militaries. And I still come back to the 40mm Bofors, still in use on CV90s today. has a very useful high explosive round.
Australians found a very useful way of getting around that, John. Yeah. And I'll tell you when we get to the Australian part of this.
Sure. But anyway, it was nuts that the British somehow thought they couldn't put a proper high explosive round in a 40mm gun. It was a bit like thinking that they couldn't build a tank if it couldn't fit through every single tunnel in Britain. When we talked to Peter Samsonov, he's got a really good account of the Russians literally spying on the British and saying, "We know you can build a high explosive round for this thing. Why aren't you sending them to us?
You just hate us that much. You want us to lose." Yeah. Anyway,
the bloody-mindedness of the British bureaucracy in some of these things is deeply annoying even today.
Yeah, perfection being the enemy of good. All right. Part of the initial design was that it was proof against enemy artillery, field artillery, and this was later changed to proof against current anti-tank guns in September 1936. Made for a specific purpose and a limited ability to be upgraded. Couldn't add a bigger gun, couldn't add more armour, couldn't make it go faster. So all those things meant it was what it was and wasn't going to get any better.
I kind of think that they could have got a better engine into that bay. I agree. A KV2 wasn't going to fit into that bay, but the engine was so poor that. But then if they got a better engine in, then they got the problem that they cut all the other corners on the suspension and return rollers. So a better engine wouldn't have They could have got a lighter engine for the same power output, and some reserve power would have been good. But yeah.
All right. The external fuel tanks fed into the tanks, so you didn't have to stop and refuel. It was very useful. Nowadays, we've all heard of the jerry cans and what you put in your external petrol and so forth.
The British had flimsies, though.
They had flimsies because the word jerry can actually comes because the German troops were carrying around these nice big cans that you could put fuel into, and they were very easy to handle.
They had handles built into the top, and they had pouring spouts built into them.
And that's why they became called jerry cans.
Jerry cans, yeah.
And everybody had these little 5-litre flimsies that had no handle, had no spigot.
Basically, if you buy olive oil in bulk, you're buying flimsies. And it's not a design I want to take bounce across a desert. I mean, they leaked all the time. There were enormous fires. And the Germans had just solved the problem with a much better reusable can.
Yeah. That a soldier could easily carry one in each hand. Mm-hmm. It's quite a decent amount of 40 litres or something like that, and away you go.
Well, the jerry can design was more that two soldiers could put a hand on either side on the handle and to move them around. Yeah.
So it's one of those things, and yet, the British had flimsies. But at least, as I say, they had these external fuel tanks that went straight into the tank rather than having to unload them and then actually pour it into the fuel tanks.
Look, if you're serious about fueling up tanks, they're pulling up to an oil tanker and they're using a Bowser to put it in. The idea of handing around 20-litre containers and pouring them into the engine, it's just terrible. It's a bad way to do things.
Right. All right. The twin engines made for more maintenance and issues, but did mean that if one engine stopped for whatever reason, you could unclutch it and then limp along on the other engine.
That would be a very slow limp, but it would still be better than walking.
Yep. Or pushing your tank.
That one's pushing a Matilda.
All right. There wasn't enough visibility for the tank. The driver had a periscope and an armoured vision slit. The commander had a periscope and 2 vision blocks in the cupola. The gunner...
It's worth noting the Australian Matildas, they actually invested a lot into getting a better commander's cupola.
Yes, but they didn't actually deploy it because it wasn't proof against 37
guns. It created problems, but yeah.
Anyway, the gunner had a very basic sight without range gradients and a periscope, and the loader had nothing. They had a hatch above them that they didn't want to stick their head out. But they were all using the Mark IV observation devices, which did provide a wide angle of vision. The Soviets especially liked the Mark IVs because they were far better than what they had in the T-34 and the KV-1s. But the Matildas could still have done with more of these vision slits and vision blocks with the Mark IV observation devices. The last tanks were delivered in August of 1943. So you'd be saying to yourself, if I was getting Matilda in August of 1943, about to go up against Panthers and Tigers and so forth, and be going, well, bugger, because you're not doing much against them, and they're going to go straight through you.
The Matilda's biggest problem for the European theatre was that they couldn't get a better gun in the turret, and the 2-pounder by 1942 was had reached end of life. Glorious service, extremely effective, great weapon for the early war. but it was well past it. And particularly, you look at how the Germans were putting applique armour on all their tanks to just get them just enough over that 40mm calibre. And also, you know, a lot of other, the French and the Americans had 37mm cannons for anti-tank work, and they were just moving that out there. And Alexander Vlad has noticed that Europe has wet grass occasionally. Yes.
We noticed that too.
But mud, it was fun in mud. It could really move along in mud, which is why, look, there's a couple of reasons why Australia loved the Matilda for the Pacific War, but the fact
we already had a song about it. I mean, that's why we really loved it.
More importantly, was that it could fit on a landing craft medium and didn't need
mechanised. I found out there's a difference between medium and mechanised.
Yeah, there is, but even a straight up medium.
Medium was actually much bigger than a mechanised.
Okay.
That's what I said. I found out these things.
But it could fit in a relatively small landing craft and didn't need a dedicated tank landing craft. And because it was very compact for its weight, and then it would just trundle along and kill Japanese, which is what we really wanted at that point.
Yeah. So LCM used, I always thought meant landing craft medium. When I looked it up a bit more closely, I realised, hang on a second, that's a really big thing. Whereas I thought, and landing craft tank was halfway between a landing craft medium and a landing craft mechanised, which was also an LCM, and it just got more complicated from there. But yes. Landing craft mechanised is where we ended up with. Anyway, operators. The Brits operated them. Soviets got sent just over 1,000. Only 913 arrived via Arctic convoys, though.
Well, let's remember.
There's a movie about that nowadays.
The Arctic convoys were unbelievably brutal. My grandfather served in the RN in World War II and got a ship shot out from underneath him. And as far as he was concerned, the worst thing, it wasn't getting torpedoed by the Japanese. It was Arctic convoys were the absolute hardest, most brutal part of the war for the RN, at least from his point of view, and he was pretty well informed. Because if you ever see photos, the guns are all dripping with ice, and all the watchstanders are trying to wear as much clothes as they can, and and then they've got to fight battles against Germans. There were significant losses in the Arctic convoys, and it was tough work.
But most of them made it through by the looks of things. All right, Australia, we got 400 delivered, and we kept them in service until 1955 as part of the citizen military forces.
Although it's worth noting that the actual army, as soon as the Japanese surrendered in 1945, said, all those Matildas out. out.
There you go. New Zealand had 33 close support tanks delivered in late 1942, but found they were too heavy for their bridges, and they didn't think they were suitable for the South Pacific, so they passed them on to Australia. They did take out 18 of the close support guns, which they were then installed in 18 of the 255 Valentine tanks, which they preferred. The Nazis, they captured some. I couldn't find any firm numbers, but whatever.
There's a lot of photos of captured Nazi Matildas, though, so they weren't hard to find. Yeah.
I couldn't find any firm numbers, but whatever was left at Dunkirk, and we do have a nice photo of Kiwi soldiers capturing a Nazi Matilda while lifting the siege of Tobruk in November of 1941, happening in the slideshow somewhere behind us. The Romanians possibly captured one or two from the Soviets late in the war, and you'd think the Italians might have captured one or so, but it was probably recaptured pretty quick. Egypt, and from what I can find, they had 140 Matildas at the end of the war.
Just leftover ones.
They were just leftover ones, but they had those from the end of the war. The Brits wanted to use the close support tanks as smoke throwers, with 2 rounds of smoke to every round of HE. And the Soviets asked/demanded that the ammo ratio of their close support tanks be 3 HE for 1 smoke. The Australians got 15 close support tanks from the Kiwis.
I just want to note there are some sources, particularly British sources, which talk about the CS things, which is using a 7.62mm howitzer in a tank cannon, as if they could only be used to fire smoke rounds, by which we mean white phosphorus. So if you get a white phosphorus round on your position, you want to move if it's an option, because it's not a pleasant thing to be surrounded by. But definitely, I've been down in the weeds of reading individual unit reports in 1944, 1945 in the Pacific. Australia was definitely using high explosive in these things. It wasn't just white phosphorus out of those.
No, they did happen. Conflicts. World War II, not a surprise.
Yep.
There was at the Battle of France, North Africa, East Africa, Crete, the Eastern Front, the Pacific Theatre, which we'll call Papua New Guinea and Borneo and the islands around it, and the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. Battles of note. From our Panzer 38T episode, I pretty much lifted this straight from there. The Battle of Arras on 20th of May, 1940. The French and British forces were entrenched in the village of Arras as Rommel went racing past when the British forces of 2 infantry battalions and supporting 58 Matilda Is and 16 Matilda IIs counterattacked, causing chaos in the German advance as they could not damage the heavy armour of the infantry tanks. 6 French Somois joined in the counterattack, but there was no coordination with the British, whose anti-tank guns opened up on the French, who then returned fire. Once the German artillery, air and 88s were brought to bear, the ineffectiveness of their tanks was overcome, and 60 of the 88 Allied tanks were lost to 37 German tanks. All right, and while this counterattack and chaos slowed the Nazis and made them delay their advance to secure the flanks of their panzer columns, it kept them from the channel long enough for the Brits to evacuate from Dunkirk. On the other hand, the chaos and confusion of the Allied command was even greater. Orders given to counterattack south, then that general replaced, and the next general given orders to counterattack north and south, and then another general dying in a car crash on his way to giving new orders, and French tanks being dispersed to infantry divisions who did not want to give them back. Then when a tank attack was needed and no communications with the Air Force, it really showed the power of the Blitzkrieg at getting inside the opponent's OODA loop, which is the observe, orient, decide, and act loop.
Look, I don't want to discount the importance of Arras because it was a very rare bright spot in 1940 in France. I do feel that the structural forces that forced the Germans to delay their advance in Dunkirk were
other things
were greater than anything that actually happened
coming down off their uppers
in Arras. But it's indisputable that it did actually give the Germans a fright that their anti-tank guns weren't stopping these tanks, and added to the institutional debate in the Germans about whether they should just push straight to Dunkirk or just woe up a minute and let the soldiers come down off their amphetamine highs.
There you go. Have we said hello to Mehdi yet? Hello, Mehdi.
Mehdi, good to join us.
Yes. Mm-hmm. All right, North Africa against the Italians. Operation Compass.
The greatest advance in history.
Queen of the desert time. Yeah. All right. December of 1940 through to the early January 1941. The Western Desert Army, which was the Commonwealth Army of 36,000 troops and 275 tanks, mostly Mark II and Mark III cruisers, but also 58 Matildas, planned a 5-day raid against 150,000 Italian and Libyan troops with 600 tanks and tankettes. The Brits didn't expect much from their raid that they were going to carry out, but the Wavell and Wilson, I think were the generals, gave the staff officers the job of considering what to do if the operation was a success and they needed to exploit the situation. And they did. They did plan, and they did succeed, and they did exploit. In the end, 133,000 prisoners were taken, 420 tanks and tankettes captured, and 800 guns, as the Italians were retreated halfway across the desert, being pushed out of Africa and halfway across Libya.
Now, I just want to quickly reinforce here. I have read the unit reports of an Australian division. It eludes me at this moment which one.
Sixth division.
Probably the 6th.
It was the 6th at this battle.
But they literally issued the troops for a dawn attack with a quart of rum each. They were drunk off their tits as they
What do you mean Australians getting drunk in battle? I cannot. You're probably going to say next they were stealing stuff as well.
A quart of rum per man. And, the Italians, when they saw 10,000 extremely drunk Australians singing football songs, decided they did not want to be part of that fight. But, yeah. It's not necessarily advised to get your troops pissed before the attack, but it works.
Except on rum, because that's a fighting,
makes you fight.
That's a fighting drink. We all know in Australia here. We all know it's a fighting drink. Anyway, it was here that the Matilda earned the name Queen of the Desert, as Italian tanks and anti-tank guns could not penetrate her armour, even though the Italians had some of the best tank guns available at that time of the war. Unfortunately, from this massive success, the British learned the lesson: take risks, spread their forces out. Their tanks were impervious and they didn't need to work with infantry. Anti-tank guns were of limited use on the offensive and brigades could defeat dug-in divisions, which soon changed when the Africa Corps arrived a month later.
The things you can do to...
people who don't want to be there.
Things you can do to Italians and things you can do to Germans, they're different things.
The people who didn't want to be there and didn't really... Anyway.
Alexander Vlad has asked if Australians make rum. We make a lot of sugar cane in Queensland and we make a small amount of quite bad rum. But yes,
we make a lot of rum.
Bundaberg rum overproof is still a rite of passage if you can drink a pint of it.
We went off rum a long time ago. As a young man, yes, you tried it and you went, nah, not for us.
Yeah, well, if you want to get in a fight, rum is the drink that you drink. But,
and the places where you drink it is where you get in a fight. East Africa against the Italians, the Battle of Keren, however you want to pronounce it, and Italian Eritrea in February to March 1941. It was mostly an infantry battle after the Italians blocked the road by blowing up the overhanging crags, and it took 8 weeks to overcome the Italian defenders to clear the road. But eventually, a squadron of Matilda tanks were on hand to capture the port of Massawa, ending the access threat to shipping in the Red Sea.
Now, just quickly, Mehdi has asked about the Matilda side skirting. Was it a hassle with heavy mud building up and barbed wire stick getting tangled in the road wheels? So, quickly, it was quite cleverly designed in that for other tanks, the side skirting has to be removed to access the suspension and the road wheels. They actually had access hatches built in, and they worked quite well. They had mud chutes which worked quite well. Some of the video footage that's playing behind us shows quite very even distribution of water as they sluice through. So the engineering was, a lot of thought went into it, and in the access panels, just the hinges on the access panels, you wouldn't be able to lift them all at once. But a lot of thought went into it, whether it was better than just saying if we ever need to access this stuff, we're removing the whole Scherzen, which is the German approach. I can't tell you which is better, but it worked reasonably well.
And it did stop barbed wire and other things getting caught in there. In the jungles, the Australians found that vegetation would get caught in there, or coral mud. So the Russians found the snow and mud would get caught in there. And again, everybody had different experiences and wet grass. Who knew how to deal with that? Nobody knows how to deal with wet grass.
No, wet grass is insurmountable. But it worked pretty well, particularly for an early war design. And they did add things like welding on little prongs to just clean out the mud. Let's move on.
Battle of Crete, May 1941. After the fall of Greece in April of 41, where Churchill once again deployed Australian and New Zealand infantry and expected them to work miracles with no equipment. There were 100 Mark II and Mark III cruiser tanks in Greece, and those defeated troops that could be evacuated end up in Crete, where once again Churchill told them to turn the island into a fortress. However, with only 9 Matildas, 16 Vickers Mark VIs, and a few universal carriers, they lacked the mobility required to defend both ends of the island and the 2 airfields there, especially as the rocky terrain and few roads limited their speed to reposition and engage the Nazi paratroopers after they managed to hold them out. So they managed to hold out the paratroopers for the first day. On the second day, they just could not get the forces to where the attacks were happening. The Matildas were especially worn out and ended up just being dug in as pillboxes. On the second day, the paratroopers were able to capture an airfield and started to bring in reinforcements. The defenders once again were evacuated in defeat, this time to Egypt. The Nazis saw the devastation of their paratroopers and loss of transport planes and never undertook an airborne assault again. The Allies saw the effectiveness of the paratroopers landing behind the lines and affecting logistics and supply routes, and saw an opportunity.
Look, I just want to touch on Crete because it's really important to understand how the British kept losing. They lost in France, they lost in Norway, they lost in Crete, and
Greece.
Yeah, and they felt that things were going extremely badly. And let's not overgild this. Things were going extremely badly. But while they lost in Norway, they sunk a third of the German destroyer flotilla. while they lost in Crete, they made the Germans hate paratrooping to the point that they never tried it again. So these two losses in Norway and Crete did create a situation where the Germans had no way to invade Britain, which no one at the time understood that was what they were creating, but it was very important in the broader strategic picture there. The Matilda didn't do much in Crete, but the big problem in Crete was that all the Commonwealth forces, and I think it was in New Zealand general, and was largely in charge, just hadn't got in their heads about running continuous 24-hour operations, because all the experience in World War I was you've got months to plan things. And
rather than 5 days from leaving Greece and ending up on Crete, and suddenly 5 days later the Nazis are turning up again.
Yeah, the pace of operations was something that a lot of generals who had been very successful in World War I failed miserably in World War II, because they were just used to being able to spend a lot of time planning. Yeah.
All right, North Africa against the Germans. Operation Battle Axe in June of 1941. The Matildas ran into a prepared German defences, and the Germans had new 50mm anti-tank guns backed by their powerful 88s. So of the 100 Matilda tanks that attacked, 63 were disabled or knocked out on the first day. The thick armour that had protected them for so far was no longer impervious to the latest anti-tank guns. The Matilda kept going into 1942, but did not see the success of those early battles again. In Operation Crusader at the end of 1941, the Matilda tanks were given the role of mopping up bypassed German and Italian forces after they were suppressed by artillery. At the Battle of Gazala in May 1942, there were only 2 battalions, maybe around 140 Matildas left, and being rather old and worn out, they took little part in the battle, suffering heavy casualties when they attacked, and the remains of both battalions were captured in Tobruk at the end of June.
Just quickly, Gazala, for those who don't know, was a case where the Germans beautifully exploited the British desire to counterattack at all costs, and basically they kept luring British tanks into kill grounds of anti-tank guns, and the lack of a high...
See our episode about the Crusader for how badly things went.
But the lack of a high explosive round was particularly lethal, because a high explosive round would have cleared out those 88s very quickly. But when you're just firing solid shot, you put a hole in the splinter guard on the weapon, and you might kill the person behind it. But if they're not behind it when you hit, then you've done nothing.
And one thing the Matildas don't do is move quickly, so they make a fairly easy target. All right. Yeah. So there was, at the end of June, there was an ignominious end of the Matilda in North Africa. I shouldn't say that. They did actually participate in the second battle of El Alamein, when they had the Scorpion mine flowers fitted to the front of them, and 25 of them helped clear the minefields on the attack to the German lines as part of the second battle of El Alamein in end of 43. The Battle of Moscow.
Driving back the Germanic hordes across the Russian steppe.
They get a participation award and bragging rights for saving Russia by 22 of them, at least 8 of which were working, being deployed in defence around Moscow prior to the 6th of December 41, when the counter-offensive began.
So just quickly, we have a half-hour chat with Peter Samsonov from the Tank Archives about the Matilda in Russian service, coming up at the halftime break.
So we'll have a bit of a chat about it here, but we'll keep going there. So deliveries had started arriving in October 41, but without spare parts, instructors, or winter preparations, the tanks took a while to be made deployable, having arrived in Archangel Murmansk type area. They were then seen as useful during early 1942, facing German 37 and 50mm anti-tank guns. But from the summer of 42, the Germans started receiving more Pak 40 75s, and I think it was the Pak 38 50mm guns, with basically higher velocity, which could easily penetrate the slow-moving British tanks. The narrow tracks of the Matilda did not deal well with the snow or ice. There are plenty of photos of Matildas rolled onto their roofs because they just slipped on the ice and rolled.
Driving on ice is hard, and Australians have no idea, very few ideas about it. I spent enough time in the Northern Hemisphere to have had a little bit of experience, and it sucks. I hate it. Yeah.
All right, but once they welded spurs onto the bottom of the tracks, they were able to deal with the winter much like the Brits learned to deal with wet grass. Most Soviet Matildas were lost during this time during the summer of 42, which was a very desperate time of the war on the Eastern Front, where they were losing more tanks than they were producing. The delivery of Lend-Lease tanks was an essential to maintain the numbers.
Although it should be noted that Lend-Lease was not the British aid project to Russia.
That was
it gets lumped in with the same name.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It was tanks getting given, or sorry, equipment being given to the Soviets from Europe, from UK and USA. Eventually, there were only 200 Matildas left, still operating in January of 1945. Papua New Guinea and Borneo and the islands thereabouts. Whilst there were very few tanks deployed and rarely, if any, tank-on-tank combat, as discussed during the Chihar episode and the fall of Malaya, if you've got 10 tanks and the enemy doesn't have anything that can stop those tanks, then 10 tanks is all you need. The initial 200 Matildas were sent to Australia in mid-1942 with no spare parts, and they had to cannibalise half of them to keep the others running. These tanks were kept in Australia as part of our newly formed armoured brigades, ready to defend against the imminent threat of Japanese invasion. So during 42 and most of 1943, Australia was relying on M3 Stuart and M3 Lee's tanks in Papua New Guinea to halt the advance of the Japanese.
Now, let's quickly note here, Australia paid for and got 1,000 M3 Lees. And then we looked at them and we said, these are awful. Can we have the much older Matildas? So that is, for everyone who's like, oh, the M3 wasn't that bad. It's like, it was so bad that we bought 1,000 of them and we said, thank you, America, for the low loaders that can move these that they came with, and then we use those to low load Matildas around. But it was as a 1939 design, let's say, it was still superior to the 1941 M3. And that is a really important thing to note when you think about this tank. We literally said, you know what? We don't want to use these M3s. We're going to go back to those older Matildas because we can do more things with them. Mostly because the Matildas could roll off the LCMs, and the Lees needed much bigger craft to land them, I suspect.
Yeah. Well, they were wider and higher and so forth. Yes, we were holding on to them to. The M3 Lees and Stuarts were in New Guinea to halt the advance of the Japanese, and it was only after they pushed them off the Kokoda track in November of 1942 when the tanks could effectively be used in the lower-lying coastal areas of Papua New Guinea on the northern side of the island. So it was not until late 1943, so November 1943, a year later essentially, when the Matildas of the 4th Armoured Brigade were deployed to the Southwest Pacific in PNG on the Huon Peninsula. The previously formed armoured brigades for the defence of Australia were broken up and instead provided a pool of unit and subunit vehicles that could be provided to infantry formations. The heavily armoured Matildas were found to be more effective than the Lees and the Stuarts in jungle fighting.
Stuarts in particular had a problem that their gearboxes were not set up to infantry walking pace. And that meant that they had enormous maintenance loads if they had to rumble at 4 or 5 miles an hour.
Knock over the coconut.
Yeah, but the shredding their gearboxes at walking pace was a huge problem for those. But yeah, I mean, Matilda just they could bolt stuff onto it, and it just worked. It was amazing.
The resiliency of the Matilda was certainly put to the test by the Japanese in November 1943 at Pabu Hill near Sattleberg.
Saddleberg was one of the most iconic battles of the South Pacific for Australian troops, but
of New Guinea. Matilda with infantry support was disabled at a range of less than 50 metres by a Japanese 37mm gun, just took out the track, and they later brought up a 75mm anti-tank gun, and then they threw on some anti-tank mines, and then they threw on some grenades, and they were all used against the tank. And although it was hit more than 50 times, the crew continued to fight the vehicle until its ammunition had been expended. They then managed to escape from the vehicle and return to it the following day.
They escaped via the belly hatch.
Yep.
Which many people look at these belly hatches and go, "There's no way a human being can get out of those hatches," but the whole crew just got out of those.
If you try hard enough and you're willing to lose some skin, you'll get out. All right.
Yeah.
Or a bit of olive oil, and away you go.
Yeah.
I always find that when in doubt, just apply olive oil to it, and it'll probably work, and you'll be able to push whatever through you need to get there.
Look, I will never forget doing caving in a high school thing, and Sonny, who was a very large guy, got stuck in a hole in the cave, and half of us knew the only way we were getting out of here was to get Sonny through that hole. So we were literally jumping on his shoulders to push him through, and we all got out.
I was just thinking of the time where I had an oven to fit into a cavity, and I'd measured the front of the cavity, and it was 54 centimetres across. I thought, well, this oven is only 54 centimetres. But the problem was the cavity angled in, and so you couldn't push it all the way back. And I said, well, how am I going to deal with this? And so I poured olive oil down the sides of the cabinet and the oven, and gave it a good old shove, and in it went. Yeah. There you go.
Right.
Anyway,
let's move on.
They came back to it subsequently, and it was repaired and put back into action later the next day.
Yeah. So again, the capacity of these things to absorb an enormous amount of damage is huge. I mean, the Japanese tactics were largely boiling down to how do we stop these things, and they were like, if we can get it stuck in a hole, we can light a fire underneath it.
We're getting to that.
Yeah, but so it's basically Ewoks. That was. Ewoks are cool.
Yeah, they are.
I'm not dissing that.
No,
yeah.
They beat the Stormtroopers.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, they're beating up fascists. I mean, that's what we like about Ewoks, and possibly eating them. I'm not sure about that, but anyway. Yeah. On another occasion, a 150mm artillery round was made into an IED. When a Matilda rolled over it, it was lifted 5 metres into the air, 18 feet. After crashing down again, the crew escaped. Vehicle bruised, battered, but they were alive.
They were lucky because the effects of mines under tanks.
5 metres. Taking a 25-ton tank, throwing it 5 metres in the air and coming back down again and going, crap, they're all dead or something like that. No.
I hope they had mouth guards in. But, yeah.
Anyway, due to the compact size of the Matilda, it could be carried on the landing craft mechanised ships rather than needing a much larger landing craft medium or a landing craft tank. This meant the Matildas were much more operationally deployable around the islands of Papua New Guinea and Borneo, of which there are probably 1,000 islands, and the Japanese had troops on
garrisons
a lot of them.
everywhere.
Garrisons. Yeah. I mean, Borneo is a big island, and it had a huge POW camp there of all the Allied troops captured at Singapore and other places within the South Pacific. And we're talking like 250,000 Japanese troops in some of these places. So it's not like it's a case of you're fighting off a single guy stuck in the jungle type thing. It's hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers.
And while they definitely lacked supplies and equipment, they were still ferocious opponents. Should not be, sorry, because a lot of my brain is naval history coded, and the way so many British ships and Australian ships that had been very successful in the European theatre in the early war came out to fight the Japanese and just had their clocks cleaned, just got smashed. Let's not understate how formidable they were. Anyway, let's move on.
Right, the Matildas were much more operationally deployable around the islands. A single tank could be loaded onto a LCM and then roll off on a coral beach from the shallow draft ships anywhere. So no docks or deep water ports or facilities were needed, which is lucky because they were very few and far between. The Australians added a tank telephone so the infantry could work with the tank in the jungle.
Let's note that they were initially built with a doorbell, which was not a bad approach for infantry communication. You just come and press the bell. People know that you want to talk to them.
And what would the commander do? Stick his head out?
Then he has to stick his head out and gets a bullet in the head.
Which is fine when you've got visibility of a kilometre or two all around you in a desert, but when your visibility is 30 to 50 metres in a jungle, and any one of those behind any one of those trees could be a Japanese sniper, you don't want your tank.
So what you want is a telephone so you can answer the call without sticking your head out of the tank.
That was one of the issues with the American tanks, the Lee and the Stuart, was that the radio signals, the radio comms they were using was different from the infantry, and so they couldn't talk to each other. So what ended up happening...
To this day, infantry and tanks having the same comnet is a huge problem that has not been completely resolved, but yeah.
So what they ended up doing is that a brave infantryman would have to sit on the back of the tank, talking into the open open cupola, to tell the the tank commander what they're looking at and where the enemy was, any positions and bunkers were. And of course, either one of those two, either the tank commander or the infantry guy giving him spotting information, would get shot. So they didn't like that.
Now, just quickly, the chat going on. Bremer's Ghost, welcome to the show. I don't think we've seen before. Is saying rum. Where is the rum? The gin is coming, my friend. Alexander Vlad is like doorbell. Oh my god, I'm dying. But the point is that the doorbell meant there was already a copper conduit into the tank. So
Japanese had a doorbell.
Yeah. So the point is that replacing the doorbell with a headset was really easy from there. All the work had already been done. So
as I was saying, the doorbell had previously been fitted. Oh, I did something.
I think you did that.
Anyway, mesh covers were added to the back of the deck to stop grenades from being rolled onto the engine, which is one way the Japanese found that they could disable the tank. And if it did not have infantry support, the Japanese would then start a fire under the tank to kill the crew, as they could not damage the tank itself.
If they managed to immobilise it. And also the idler wheels were incredibly vulnerable, and the Japanese figured that out very quickly because they are crafty buggers.
Careful. We've seen those Japanese identification videos from Australia in 1943 or whatever it was.
Where they misidentified the tank. Yeah.
And also what they call them. Anyway, they also added front track guards to keep the jungle vegetation from being caught up in the tracks. So you can easily distinguish the Australian tanks because they had these great big track guards on the front, whereas the other tanks didn't, even though I'm looking at a photo now that... Anyway, we'll keep going. They also welded on a Y-shaped mud scraper inside the track guards to dislodge coral mud from being built up in the tracks. They also put on welded a shoulder... metal shoulder around the turret ring to stop vegetation from getting caught up under the turret ring when going through the jungle. Now, here we go. Australia also developed a more effective 2-pounder HE shell late in the war by taking the propellant part of the anti-tank round and affixing the HE part of the 40mm Bofors round.
Go.
Bloody genius. Whoever would have thought of that?
Yeah. I've been saying for years, the Bofors gun existed. How can you say you can't make a high explosive round? You losers.
We don't know why. Anyway, whilst Australia has the most remaining Matilda tanks, around 30 something or other, many more were dumped at sea on the return from the Southwest Pacific. Models.
Yay.
All right. According to Peter Samsonoff, the models were...
Ooh.
Gently. The infantry tank Mark II, which was the original Matilda with the Vickers machine gun and the AEC engines. The infantry tank Mark IIA with the Baser machine gun. The infantry tank Mark IIA Star with the Leyland engines. The infantry tank Mark IIA Star with the improved Leyland engines. And then you throw on CS onto any one of those to designate that tank as a close support tank with the 3-inch howitzer. But supposedly Churchill couldn't stand this, so they became known as, but not officially, as Infantry Tank Mark II, which was the Matilda I. The Infantry Tank Mark II became the Matilda I, ignoring the existing A11 Matilda I.
Right.
Infantry Tank Mark IIA became the Matilda II. Infantry Tank Mark IIA Star became the Matilda III. Infantry Tank Mark IIA Star became the Matilda IV. And the Matilda V, which didn't get any stars, had an improved gearbox and the Westinghouse air servo installed. You could still throw the CS designation onto any of them to say it was a close support tank with the 3-inch howitzer. But you wouldn't call it a Infantry Tank Mark IIA Matilda II. That just sounds silly, doesn't it? I can't remember where I've said it, but Peter comes out with a very good episode on the pedantry of naming a tank, and it's all about the Matilda. And I like going on pedantry. Actually. Variants. The Matilda Baron. It was an experimental Matilda chassis with a mine flail. They were never used operationally, but they did use the Matilda Scorpion, which was another chassis with a mine flail affixed to the front of it, much like the Hobart's funnies on the Churchills. Used in North Africa during and after the Battle of El Alamein, Second Battle of El Alamein, as it was no longer a frontline tank and they needed new roles to keep, well, they had the serviceable chassis, so why not keep using them? Matilda CDL, or Canal Defence Light. The turret was replaced with a new one containing a massive searchlight with 13 million candle power, which would then project through a 2-inch vertical slit, so you couldn't just shoot the light out, to illuminate enemy positions as well as blind and disorientate the enemy at night. It had nothing to do with canals. That was just a cover story.
The canal defence lights were so secretive that it's very hard to figure out what the hell they were all about, but they were very impressive pieces of machinery.
The Matilda versions were never deployed, but the M3 Lee conversions were. They helped with the defence of the bridge at Remagen when German frogmen were swimming under the river to try and blow up the bridge.
Light them up!
They lit them up and they saw them with the canal defence lights. Anyway, the Matilda with a Cromwell turret, so it could mount a 6-pounder gun. All paperwork on the one prototype built were lost during the Vulcan factory fire of 1962, but there are photos of it. Matilda II Black Prince, a radio-controlled decoy prototype to be used to draw fire or to trundle up and explode on demolition missions. They planned to build 60, but it was cancelled as it needed a different type of transmission. It also mounted a 6-pounder. Now, when I read this, I'm going, hang on a second. Why? I'm pretty sure this is just an internet stitch-up from World of Tanks, that this tank never existed. And yeah, I think it's just one of those things of saying fake tanks that exist on the internet only. The Soviets tried mounting a 76mm Zeiss 5 gun in the Matilda. It fit, and with a bit of mucking around, they worked out that they could get it in there, but they decided the 40mm gun was good enough and not to waste any time and resources on reconfiguring an acceptable tank. Plus, they needed every tank they could get from mid-1942. The Australian Frog, Hedgehog and Dozer, or as I like to think of them, the shall be right, mate, tanks.
Neither of which worked, but yeah.
The Frog worked.
The Frog worked, yeah. So
the Australian brass said they needed a flamethrower tank. So Major Murray, let's call him Muzzer, designed one for them using cordite to propel a flame. They ignored it, so Muzzer designed another one. They ignored that too. Eventually, they realised this guy Muzzer knew what he was doing, and so they let him build a flamethrower tank using compressed air to shoot the flame forward. This first version became the Matilda Frog. The Frog mounted the flamethrower, fuel, and compressed air all in the turret, so they didn't have to deal with fuel lines running out of the back of the trailer to a trailer like the Crocodile.
It did make the cruise pretty miserable to be completely surrounded by flammable fuel, but yeah.
This also took up all the room in the turret except for the gunner/burner boy, who was surrounded by highly flammable fuel. He loved it. It had a range of about 80 metres, but it was found to usually be employed at the range of 20 to 30 metres in the jungle. It carried 80 imperial gallons internally. It could carry another 162 gallons externally on the hull. So for around 24 bursts of flame. But the air compressor needed about 30 seconds between each discharge. So 25 were deployed to the Southwest Pacific, and they were very effective at clearing out Japanese defensive positions and bunkers. Armoured units would usually deploy with 1 or 2 gun tanks, a close support tank as a troop leader, and a frog where it was available.
It was interesting, the Australian tank squadrons in the South Pacific often were six tank formations, which is not where the state of the art is today, but they like being able to mix the gun tanks, the frogs and the CSs in the formation.
There you go. Muzzer built another version with his original idea of the cordite propellant, which had a greater range of about 100 metres. It took up less space, so it had a 130 imperial gallon tanks inside the turret. These, however, never left Australia.
But he did make them work.
He made them work. He showed that I know what I'm talking about, guys. Why would anybody listen to me? Anyway, the Matilda tank Dozer. When clearing jungles, filling in bomb craters and building roads for other vehicles, including more tanks, to travel along, there is little better than a bulldozer. Once the Japanese saw the Australian engineers using them, they became priority targets, especially as they were unarmoured. So the simple solution was to mount the dozer blades on the front of a Matilda. 18 were converted by 1945. The dozer blade was mounted on the front and controlled by a hydraulic winch mounted on the side of the tank. Unfortunately, the extra weight at the front of the tank made them hard to steer and prone to getting stuck. And without the engine power to manoeuvre out of the predicament, they were they couldn't get out of what they'd gotten themselves into. So they were all converted back to gun tanks by the end of the war. The Matilda Hedgehog. Wanting a bigger bomb to take out Japanese bunkers in the jungle, the Army took an idea from the Navy and decided to adapt a spigot mortar depth charge. These mortars were lined up in a row of 6 on the rear deck of the Matilda. The firing platform would then be elevated to the correct height for the distance the bombs would be thrown, out to 180 metres. Then the tank turned to face the correct direction. The fuses were set, and then the 30-kilogram mortars with 15 kilograms of HE would be fired individually or as a salvo of 6, as long as you had the turret turned so that it didn't hit the the aerial for the radio, in the direction of the enemy. Vaguely in the direction of the enemy.
And this is one of the things where you need an incredibly robust vehicle to trundle into position for these ranges. If this tank wasn't the most heavily armoured thing in the South Pacific, this concept would not have flown. As it is, it never got deployed, but it was still a really interesting, useful concept that relied on the almost indestructibility of the Matilda tank.
So ships, when with these spigot mortars,
to hit submarines,
they would basically launch 24 of these things in front of the ship as they were driving into an area with they think a submarine might be, and they'll just let them try and blow up anything that was in front of them. So they were basically clearing the way.
Well, they had contact fuses. If the fuse hit the submarine, it went boom. Yeah.
So, as I said, they weren't terribly accurate, but they were effective at throwing in a great big HE round.
They would have been if they'd ever been deployed, which they weren't.
Yeah, the trials were completed in May 45, and they were sent overseas. However, before the war ended, before they were actually able to be used operationally, 6 of them were built. All right, legacy. Time for legacy. All right, here we go. The Matilda was in service from the start of the war in 1939 all the way through to the end of 1945, and fought in every theatre from France, North Africa, East Africa, Crete, Eastern Front, and the Pacific. Cannot find anything about them being deployed to India, but there is one at the Indian Tank Museum up there.
Okay.
Yeah, or Burma. So, but that theatre is all lumped together as the CPI, which is the China, Pacific, and India theatre. So you can still say they fought in every theatre. If 50 more of them had made it to France, and it was used correctly, who knows what would have happened? If 50 of them had been sent to Malaya and it was used correctly, who knows what would have happened there?
A Matilda could have defeated Chiha, so and definitely a Hargo.
But would they have been in the right spot?
Yeah,
is the question.
Sure.
Right. So Malaya's not a small place, and unless they were lined up on anyway, 900 were sent to Russia, and they participated.
Participation award.
400 were sent to Australia, and we made good use of them.
Well, we paid for them. But yeah.
We made good use of them on all the islands held by the Japanese. All right. Or as the T-shirt says, old and slow all the way to the edge.
That's our first T-shirt that we ever made.
And I'm wearing it right now underneath my Brumbies jersey. But don't worry, girls in Panzer. The Matildas are used by the St. Gloriana Girls College in all iterations of Girls in Panzer, anime, de film, manga, and das Finale. Which manages to give the venerable Matilda the one thing it has never had before: unbelievable anime speed.
Yeah, that fixes all the problems. Yeah.
All right, the poll. You guys love the Matilda.
Oh, you love it. 100%. One of the goats. Yeah.
9 votes.
Yeah.
All right, and with that, we folks will take a little bit of a break and come leave you with a chat with Peter Samsonov about the Matilda in Russia.
Yep.
And we'll come back in about 35 minutes.
We have quite a lot of other issues in the world of
because there's a lot of things happening
to talk about.
The last 2 days. Who knows?
All right. So the video's going on, and you guys are going to love it. And we'll be back in half an hour. So it's a very great pleasure to be joined once again by Peter Samsonov, the tank archive himself, and most importantly, the author of British Tanks of the Red Army, the book, which is available on Amazon and wherever else you get good books, I assume. Peter, welcome to the show. Welcome back.
It's great to be here again.
Now, so at this point, for most of the audience have seen us talking about the Matilda in general and the Matilda in the Pacific and obviously northern France most famously. But the big question is, in lots of British sources, you know, we've literally got a video where they're talking about the Matildas rolling back the German hordes across the Russian steppes, you know, contributing greatly to the victory. And let's get the big one out of the way. How important was the Matilda II on the Eastern Front?
I would say the Matilda was quite important, but not for the reasons that a lot of people think. I think you've mentioned the kind of misconception that Matilda won the Battle of Moscow, and I've seen just
all three of
today,
them.
all three of them. Yes, I've seen just today on Blue Sky. Someone said that 75% of Soviet armor at the Battle of Moscow was British, and no. Just to kind of set the record straight, I have the map right in front of me, and I can read you off the numbers. There were 13 Matildas at Narofominsk, and there were 15 Matildas further up north at Klin, and that's it.
Were those the ones that are actually active, or were they including the ones that were in the shop? Because the last numbers I read was there was eight on station, and 5 of them were in the shop.
Well, that's quite an interesting question. I think in order to talk about sort of the reliability and how many Matildas were on the front line, we need to roll back a little bit to essentially the history of how these tanks actually showed up at Moscow. I'm going to gloss over the details because it's all in the book. But as we all know, you had the Three Powers Conference in Moscow, British and Americans. This was before what we call Lend-Lease decided to offer aid to the Soviet Union, which includes shipment of tanks. Unfairly, British aid gets lumped with Lend-Lease. British aid was not Lend-Lease. The British had their own program for the USSR. It wasn't free. The Soviets were paying with gold and with natural resources, but they were much more willing to part with their tanks than the Americans were. British tanks arrived earlier, and you actually had British tanks on the front lines in 1941, as opposed to American tanks who just arrived at the very tail end of 1941 and did not make it into battle. You actually see in different sources, it says tanks came in 1942. That's because they were officially only received in 1942, which is just on the cusp of the 2 years. And British tanks first arrived in, I think the first shipment was way at the end of September, on the convoy PQ-1. And so instructors and spare parts did not come until convoy PQ-2. And as you can see, when you're receiving a foreign tank with very different controls, built for a very different environment, all of the parts and bolts and nuts use a different system of measurements that you didn't have in the USSR produced locally. This can introduce some problems. And so really these tanks kind of made it to the front lines by the end of November of 1941 with crews that got minimal instruction. That's not to say that in the most desperate hour of the Soviet Union, tank crews in general were really, had time for years and years and years of training. Training was greatly accelerated, but at the very least, Soviet tank conventions hadn't really changed that much from T-26 to the T-34, the BT series, many of which were still in service. Matildas and Valentines, on the other hand, were a little bit new, so who knows how much of this was the sort of general reliability issues of the platform. How much of it was these tanks just weren't suited for warfare in deep snow, or how much of it was genuinely the drivers didn't know what they were doing and the repair crews didn't know what they were doing and they kind of had to learn on the job. But on the balance, and add to that, of course, the tanks had just starting to arrive, and if a tank is shipped to Arkhangelsk and unpacked, loaded on the train, that doesn't mean it gets to Moscow in a day or a week. It's going to take a couple of months. And so the tanks that arrived in September, October just got to Moscow by the end of November and did have time to take part in the fighting.
So they were there by the December 6th when the actual defense of Moscow was up until, and then before they started on the offensive phase. So unlike the American tanks, they took part, and so the British can put their hand on their heart and say they won it for the Russians. I don't think anybody believes. Anybody who knows that doesn't believe, of course, but the Brits are going to say it.
Well, it's one of those kind of patriotic, my guy's better than your guy kind of deals. And on the Soviet side, you might see hardcore patriots say Matilda is incomparable to a T-34 or a KV. It's much slower. The gun is weaker. It drowns in snow. Why did we even bother buying these things?
I did like your article in Tank Archives where they'll put through the paces of crossing snow obstacles, and it took the Matilda, I think it was 21 minutes, and it took the T-34 10 seconds. And I thought that's a real good comparison of the difference in the ability and maneuverability of the tanks.
Sorry, I've got a question here, Peter. You've got, in terms of engines, you've got the Kharkiv V2, which is double overhead cam, aluminium block, fuel injected, basically a 1990s Toyota Camry being produced in 1938. And in the Matilda, you've got Bedford bus engines. Sorry, not to be Bedford, but literally Routemaster double-decker bus engines bolted together. Did the Russians talk in their stuff about how primitive the engines of the imperialists were? Did they think they were being sent the garbage?
They're not specifically about the engines. So there are some doubts about the quality of the gear they're receiving. And sometimes the gear was quite bad. Particularly, one example that really pops out was the ammunition that came with Thompson and Riesing submachine guns. All the casings were mismatched, different materials, different color, different manufacturers, and the Soviets rightfully assumed that the Americans were just sweeping whatever they had left over from the corners of the warehouse and sending it over. With the British, there was a bit of a scandal around ammunition because neither the Matilda nor the Valentine came with high explosive or even fused armor piercing ammunition. It was only solid shot. And Soviet intelligence,
which was all they had, but yeah,
it was all they had. Soviet intelligence, which was still operating in the United Kingdom, and despite being allies, they dug up blueprints of the pre-World War II fused AP, 40 millimeter AP, and they were waving these around, saying, "Look at this ammunition that you have. How come you're not sending it to us? You're keeping all the good stuff to yourself." They didn't know that what they were getting was the good stuff. The fused AP was discarded in favor of solid shot because it was so brittle and the fuse tended to detonate prematurely. So you did have these confusions where early on there was still this kind of mistrust, quite a bit of mistrust between the two sides, and you can see it in the way that the military mission was treated, where the instructors I mentioned that came with PQ2, they were actually kicked out. In November, the Soviet side said, "We're good. We've learned everything we needed to know. Please leave." Of course, that didn't happen. The British soldiers remained in the receiving departments to make sure that things were coming from the UK well packed, and I think that the improvements in deliveries actually really helped, because if you read early on, tanks were stowed on the deck. Tanks were subject to all sorts of adverse weather, salt water.
Never ship a tank on a deck. That's one thing you learn from World War II.
Right, yeah. And Valentines with aluminium idlers would come in, and the idlers just corroded to uselessness. You have these kind of hardcore patriots saying, "Oh, well, the British did this on purpose. The British sabotage, they're sending us garbage, they're packing it badly, they want us to lose."
Stalin being a man who's happy to wield power, do you feel that some of this might have been him basically putting the hard word on the Western Allies to say, "Look, you're sending us rubbish, you need to send us more and better," just as a negotiating tactic? I know some of it would have been that, yeah, it was rubbish, but I think he's a man who knows how to play up the idea of you need to do better, otherwise I'm pulling out, and sucks be to you lot.
I haven't seen anything to confirm. Stalin, he didn't dance around these issues. There's a document directed to Soviet factories, which just says, in no uncertain words, the front line needs T-34s like the air we breathe. If you don't produce the quota, then, we'll treat you like a saboteur and a Trotskyist wrecker. There are documents very strongly worded. I think there was one about a shipment of Airacobras, which the British kept for their own needs. And yeah, there were some accusations thrown around about you're stealing from us. This was Soviet Airacobras and you took them. I don't know what the actual context of this was. I didn't dig that deep into this kind of specific scenario. But it goes to serve that Stalin did not hold back his words when it came to accusing either his own people or foreign suppliers of sabotage or stealing or supplying garbage. And I have not seen any kind of direct accusation or this kind of attempt at leverage. You do see in 1942 and onwards this kind of rapport grow between the Soviet side and the British and the American side. Instructors and engineers come over and they inspect the condition of the parts that were sent. And exactly the same thing was happening between the British and the Americans. So the British would receive tanks and they just wouldn't work. Instead of having some brackets welded on, they were just stuck together with paint, for example. That was one particularly egregious instance. And you had exactly the same spat back and forth, right? As, what are you Yankees doing? You're not really holding up your end of the bargain. And the Americans are saying, well, it's actually user error. Our tanks are great and perfect. So the relationship in many ways between the British and the Soviets, as strained as it was not particularly different from the relationship between the British and the Americans.
Did the as they shipped over more tanks and more equipment, do you think the relationship improved, or did it maintain the same level of antagonism or trust and but verify type of activity of between the Allies as the war went on?
I would say definitely improved. You see very active exchange of information, very active exchange of samples. So the Panther tank that was tested in Bovington, Panther 432, the one that is a very famous photo of it. The gun has been removed and there's just a dummy weight, and you see the suspension kind of bent, I think, is driving over some kind of obstacle course. That was a tank captured at Kursk that the Soviets shipped over to the UK because the British didn't have any of their own Panthers. Quite a few samples were sent over. Quite a few studies were sent over. If you compare technical drawings in Soviet and British reports, exactly the same, line for line. So it's very the British asked for information, and this was, I think, in late 1941. I have a document where the British straight up write, the Soviets were very forthcoming when it comes to German tanks. They'll let us look at them. They'll tell us anything we want to know about German tanks. When it comes to Soviet tanks or even Soviet tank units that use British tanks, they were mum. Very, very classified. You see reports on the British side where they were getting more data from German propaganda pictures or German propaganda video, where they were estimating, based on these photos, the thickness of the KV-1's top armor was 30 millimeters, which is a pretty good estimate, actually. Kind of all these things. So it wasn't until 42, 43 when the Soviets warmed up to the British and Americans, and you actually get T-34s and KVs sent over for closer study. The only thing that they requested, and I'm not sure if the request was ever granted, but it definitely wasn't granted right away, was the Katyusha rocket launcher. Those were considered so secret that every single one actually came with a demolition charge to blow it up in case it was in danger of capture. Of course, the Germans got their hands on them eventually, but the Soviets were willing to share the T-34 with the British, but not the Katyusha.
That's interesting. Peter, I've got a question. I mean, so the PQ convoys over the Arctic Circle to Archangel and Murmansk, they were desperately hard-fought affairs. You know, I mean, they literally fought battleship duels, fighting their way through, and there were tremendous losses. And, you know, Dudley Pound was dying of brain cancer while trying to coordinate these things. The opportunity cost of a Matilda tank on one of these convoy ships is quite large. They could have moved a lot of ammunition or food or fuel or trucks or lots of things the Soviets needed. So the Soviets must have seen some value in continuing to get them when they could have got really other useful stuff in that space.
Yeah, so the Matilda, I think the Matilda gets a bad rap because of the kind of fighting that it was involved in. Similar to what kind of the British had, where the career of the Matilda had that kind of... The debut with the British Expeditionary Force was kind of marred by losing. The Matilda enjoyed success in North Africa, and when it kind of was obsolete, it was withdrawn. By early 1943, very few of them remained on the front lines, and the Matilda kind of got to retire on a high note.
To the South Pacific.
They were used in the Pacific against Japanese tin cans with 37mm guns, so it remained competitive there. But in North Africa and Europe, they weren't really used. The Soviet Matilda had a much worse time of it after the couple of tanks that were used in the Battle of Moscow. No more Matildas arrived in the front line until the spring of 1942, where the Soviet counteroffensive ran out of steam. And
you
the
think
battle...
that was because they were trying to do a build-up of tanks to provide a new force, or was it just a case of they don't want them in the front line?
It was a sort of... As far as I can tell, Soviet High Command noticed that using foreign tanks with crews that don't really know the ins and outs of these tanks is a terrible idea.
On the offensive, or just or in general? So
in general, plus these tank battalions that I mentioned, where there were 4 that used British tanks in the defensive phase, 4 more in the offensive phase, they weren't armed exclusively with Matildas. They were armed with, you know, a company of Matildas, a company of Valentines, and a company of T-60s, or some T-26s they found, or a BT-7, or one battalion had no Matildas at all, and it was just Valentines. So these kind of ad hoc units slapped together are all fine if you're defending the capital and you're in desperate need of any kind of tank unit at all.
And not doing a lot of maneuver where you might be running into your own tanks that don't recognize you.
Yeah, that too, but parts commonality, very important. There's a reason why later in the war, 42, 43, you had units with Sherman tanks and with Valentines, because they use the same engine. They both use the same grade of diesel. Much more convenient just to have them together. Similarly, American M3s, M3 light, M3 medium, put them together in the same unit. They both use the same fuel, aircraft grade gasoline. They both use the same kind of general set of spare parts, so little screws and whatnot. You don't mix and match. It just makes everything easier. Same ammunition makes everything easier. You don't want to have, this 76mm ammunition is for the T-34. This 76mm ammunition is for the Matilda with the 3-inch howitzer, right? Just confusion. You know, and nobody needs that.
Speaking of the 76, so you got the they did try putting the Zeiss 5 76 or 75mm in the Matilda and said not enough, not good enough. Do you know if any thoughts were put of how about we swap out the engine and put a T-34 engine in and get it up to 500 horsepower? Or what would that do for the Matilda?
I haven't seen any proposal.
Neither have I, but I thought it would be if anybody would know, it would be you.
putting in new engines, generally not something that was done. The V2 is not a small engine. It's a fairly large engine. In a way, the engine defines the size of the tank, right? The height dictates the height of the hull. The size of the cooling system dictates the width of the hull, how much fuel it needs, how many fuel tanks you need, et cetera, et cetera. I think if you put a T-34 engine into a Matilda, you would have one of those American hot rods with the engine sticking out of the top of the deck. Not a very useful fighting machine. And also, the key part, and the same reason, one of the primary reasons why the Matilda with the Soviet gun was rejected, is where are you going to get the parts and where are you going to get the workshops? There was not exactly a great surplus of engines. There was not a great surplus of workshops. And really, all of these rearming proposals, and there were more after the attempts in 1941 to put the 76 millimeter gun in a Matilda and 45 in a Valentine. There were more proposals, and generally the conclusion was the tanks are fine. Which is, you can talk a lot about, the armor is thicker in the Soviet tanks, or the gun is better, or the engine is stronger, it goes faster, right? But at the end of the day, for the duration of 1942, which was the hardest year of the war, in terms of casualties, in terms of kind of progress, because the Red Army leadership really wanted to capitalize on the momentum of the Battle of Moscow. The spirit of the time was, we'll drive the Germans all the way back to Berlin. We've got this. And it turns out, no, they have not got this. The summer of 1942 was mired by this kind of positional warfare, World War I style even, where Matilda tanks, that was really the year that most Matildas saw battle, is 1942, where you're just driving into the same anti-tank defenses over and over and over and over again. And that's not really... Grinder. Yeah, the British could have sent Centurions, the British could have sent, Leopard 2s or something. It would have been exactly the same result. Is the Matilda, there is no tactical or technical improvement you could have made to the Matilda that would have made it excel in that conditions. But unfortunately, the vast majority of fighting was in that state. By 1943, you see kind of the trickle of Matildas dry up. The Germans at this point already have powerful guns that could penetrate its armor at long range. You, of course, had the 88, but the bigger tank killer was the 75, the Puck 40, and the tank version on the Panzer IV. In turn, the Matilda's 2-pounder really couldn't penetrate a modernized Panzer IV at a range of more than 50 yards or so. And the Matilda's turret was
suicidal ranges, basically, for the 2-pounder at that point.
Yeah, so the Matilda's usefulness kind of declined just because tanks around it got more powerful. And the Soviets and the British figured out around the same time that this is not really a tank suited for frontline service anymore.
Fair enough. And it was nearly 1,000 Matildas that made it to the Soviet Union, wasn't it? Like 900 and something?
916, yes.
Yeah. So that's a lot of tanks in most people's books. I mean, I know the Eastern Front, it's a drop, but it's a lot of tanks anywhere else.
Oh, absolutely. It is a lot of tanks. But then the British also sent 3,000 Valentines and the Americans sent 4,000 Shermans. So quite a few, but the Matilda doesn't really, it's not up there in terms of numbers to be famous. And it doesn't really have any significant successes that could be credited to it. So it kind of falls by the wayside a little bit, even though this was a tank that very much deserves the credit. It was helpful. These tanks were ordered not just because there was nothing else to buy. These tanks were helpful to the Red Army. And a lot of the time, Matilda gets compared to the T-34 a lot because, well, a T-34 weighs about 26 tons and a Matilda weighs around 26 tons. So they're kind of peers in terms of weight class, but then the T-34 is faster. It has a bigger gun. not really directly comparable in terms of their tactical mission. But really, in 1941, early 1942, the tank you should be comparing it with is not a T-34, because if you don't have the Matilda, you're not going to get a T-34 in exchange. You're going to get...
I was about to say that T-34s were pretty thin on the ground in late 41, 42. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. In 1942, you see a very radical shift towards T-34 production. Even the USSR's only factory that built heavy tanks was building more T-34s than they were building KVs, because the army needed this tank so desperately. The majority of the Red Army's needs was still served by light tanks, T-60s, T-70s. In 1943, you see the Su-76 and then the Su-76M enter production. So light vehicles, for a very large part of the war, made up most of the Red Army's tank forces. And so, is the Matilda a better tank than a T-34? Not really. Is the Matilda a better tank than a T-70? Probably. And of course, Matilda is a better tank than no tank at all, which is, of course...
Just ask the British in Singapore, where we were speculating last episode about if the Brits had sent some of the Valentines, or possibly even Matildas, that they sent to Russia in the end of 41 to Singapore, then maybe the Japanese may not have made such great gains with their Chihas as they raced down the Malayan Peninsula. But we'll never know.
Oh, very possibly. I mean, in the fall of 1941, what you actually see is what documents refer to as unhorsed tankers. So, knights who have lost their steed. Great, you've been promoted to infantry. Pull the machine gun off of the flaming wreck that used to be your tank a few minutes ago, and off you go into battle. And this was a colossal waste of trained personnel. There's a lot of, again, all the way from the top from Stalin, a lot of yelling and a lot of finger pointing. And there's an explicit order that trained personnel, tankers, mechanics, whatever, cannot be assigned to any other duties. And among various other kind of changes that improved the prestige of the tank crewmen within the Red Army, in addition to some other specialists, but specifically for tankers, we can say that, for example, a commander of a Matilda tank, which was classified as a medium, just because you had to fit it somewhere into the Soviet tank classification, in the summer of 1941, if they had any, or in the fall of 1941, could have been a sergeant or a senior sergeant. As of, I think it was also September, I have the exact date of the document somewhere, the ranks required for certain positions changed. So now the commander of a medium tank would be a junior lieutenant or a lieutenant, just to reflect the amount of training and the amount of, the value of this highly trained crewman.
Speaking of the crews, would they, once you're in a Matilda or a Valentine, would those crews stay with those sort of tanks throughout the war, or would they be moved around back into a T-34 or some other vehicle if needed, or is it a case of, no, you're trained in this foreign tank, we're going to leave you in it?
It would change. So it really depended on what was available when you returned to base to refit. You see these more so with the Shermans and the British tanks, but kind of these two polar opposite myths, where one says that foreign tanks were only reserved for the best of the best, the elite of the elite. And one said that foreign tanks were given to just your rejects. If you got a foreign tank, you'll never be awarded any medals, any orders, and your achievements would never be celebrated. Both of those are wrong. We can see from period documents that, a tank is a tank. You have a photo shoot. So this wasn't just one-off picture. They specifically set this up of the tank of four heroes, and it is a Matilda tank. It is named so because everybody in the crew I can't remember what they were awarded. I think it was something Order of the Red Banner. So pretty high up there in terms of Soviet decorations. And they actually had a plaque welded to the side that said the tank of 4 heroes. So their achievements were celebrated, even though they accomplished them in a foreign tank. But as I mentioned before, you really want your tank unit to have exactly the same kind of tank. So if you go back to refits, let's say all your tanks are usually, when your unit is pulled out the front line, all of your surviving tanks are given to someone else, and you get a whole new set. So if it's T-34s, then it's T-34s. If it's Shermans, then it's Shermans. Obviously, there's some preference for units that previously used a certain kind of tank to stay with that kind of tank. But you do see units that had Matildas and Valentines move over to domestically produced tanks. You see some ersatz training or marching formations as late as 1944 assigned a mix of Matildas and Valentines in this very heterogeneous kind of composition. But that's an exception. That was kind of, we need to give you something to train on. Here's some tanks we found in the backyard. And they would collect actually in the Far East. Matilda's, Valentines, M3s, all these kind of tanks that were no longer suitable for the front line. Where, again, they were replacing T-26s, BT-7s, tanks that were worn out after a decade of service. So they were still welcome additions. And they stuck around until even after the war in the 40s. You see reports saying, hey, we got all these tanks. What do you want us to do with them? They aren't really useful as fighting tanks. There's no more spare parts for them. How do you scrap, or give us a sign? Usually they were sent as tractors. The Red Army generally had a shortage of tractors, and when you're rebuilding the country after the war, you need construction equipment. So much like Sherman tanks, you take the turret off and you got yourself a tractor. Not a very good one, but better than nothing.
Better than no tractor. Just quickly before we let you go, Peter, Russian tank crew training, it was reasonably intensive. It was, 6 months that they had to do to get their to get in action?
It depended on the period of time. So before the war, a standard term of enlistment was 2 years, and you really kind of, over the course of the first year, got the feeling for just kind of army life, army service, and your second year was more of, okay, here's how you fight in a large formation. Here's how you master your craft. And these were hundreds and hundreds of hours of courses and individual study and practical exercises. When the war broke out, these were expedited a little bit. The term was 6 months, I believe. At some point, it was increased to a year. But generally, throughout the war, I keep seeing one complaint from every tank commander is that reinforcements came in. They don't know anything about anything. And I think this is a sentiment that will be echoed by every commander in history, especially as there's a bit of a tension between the actual people fighting on the front lines and those whizzes back there in headquarters in their ivory towers who have no idea what it's like out here. And of course, experience gained on the front lines will take some time to trickle down and be formalized and put together into textbooks. Whereas when you're on the front line, you just learn from the guy next to you. And so a lot of the time, you finish your training in whatever academy you were in, you go in the front lines, and it's time for more training to get improved cohesion within your units, to improve cohesion with the people you'll be fighting shoulder to shoulder to, and in many cases to actually learn the tank that you'll be using, because especially if you're using a foreign tank, there's no guarantee that you got to practice on one when you were still learning. So you finished your training. That doesn't mean that your training is actually over. And there was seasonal training, specific training. So if you're training to assault, for example, a large urban center, you would practice that. If you're training to tackle fortifications, you would practice that. If you're If it's the winter's coming, you need to practice winter maintenance. The summer's coming, then you need to deal with the rains and the mud and the engines overheating, and you would have this kind of refresher training every so often. So that makes it hard to put a real number on it. But nobody was herding untrained peasants into the tank at gunpoint and welding up the hatch after them. Red Army tank crewmen were highly trained and highly skilled, and you can see the results in period documents.
Yeah, I was thinking there was a tremendous investment of time and resources and even just food in these training pipelines, which is why I imagine they got very angry when unhorsed tankers were being put into the infantry role. Okay, Peter, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell our audience where they can find more of you?
My website is tankarchives.com. That's where the majority of my material is. It can be found on YouTube under Tank Archives, on Blue Sky or on Twitter, and on Facebook as Tank Archives Blog.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much, Peter.
Now we're back, and thanks again to Peter for his time and knowledge of the Matilda. As mentioned before, he has a great video about the John, it's not going.
Oh,
about the pedantry. I didn't break it. It wasn't me.
Yeah. So thank you to Peter, and there we go. There you go, Rob. Off you go.
And as we mentioned before, he has a great video about the pedantry of the name of the Matilda tank that you should watch. Everybody should watch that one because I appreciate it because I'm very precise about these things. And for those who wanted to see more wartime film of the Matilda on campaign, the Australian War Memorial Collection has a number of films available to view online. But be warned, some of them are quite graphic. More than you don't want to show your 11-year-old daughter. That's
so we'll put them on the show notes for totallytank.net for those who want to watch that. Now, the most important part of the show is when we thank the patrons, Robert.
Thank you, patrons.
Yes. So the folks on the inside group chat that even Peter Hegseth couldn't mess up, we have our Artissifa tier. They get the interview early and the ad-free video version. So, they're the reel in a wheel. And we have Brian Jenkins, Chicago John, Chris Pezze, Cornelius Weber, Johnny Oot, Late Apex, Maxi Mist, Monty Mace, and Pear. And then in our apprentice tier, which is cheaper, but they also get the ad-free version of the show, we have Anton Gorbanov, Callum Malky King with his pet tortoise Matilda, Carter Heller, Christoph Keller, Dan Sepienza, David Mulvaney, Elliot Spicer, Floaty Burb, Gihook, Hans Wang, Henry Hamed, J. Beckman Strauss, Jamie Stokes, Red Rum X, Russell Phillips, Scotch 12, Steve Broomfield's new patron, thank you Steve, Steve Matthews, and Tony L. In terms of Patreon and Apple Bastardry, we come back to just subscribe via the website rather than the app, and then we will get more of your dollars, but just subscribe one way or another is great for us. Now, Rob, what's happening with the beer review?
Now, beer review. Is it International Beer Day today, John? No. It's International Gin Day today. So we're trying something different. Mm-hmm. All right? And with having that most galactic of British drinks, the gin and tonic. Mm. So we have pre-poured ourselves one, and
yes.
This is...
Here we go.
All right.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Ooh.
I do like a gin and tonic.
So this is the Fox Dog Mandarin Gin.
All right.
Mm-hmm. And it delivers. It delivers well. Yeah.
It's so Fox Dog Distillery is down in Mogo in New South Wales, which is just around the corner from where I like to go to the beach. And so I was down there for dinner last Saturday night during the Monarch's Sovereign's birthday long weekend.
So it's just Chuck's birthday, but
yeah, it is Charlie.
It's not his birthday; it's King George V's birthday. But anyway, it's just the day we do the King's birthday.
It's the opening of the ski season, all that sort of fun stuff. Yeah. So yeah, I was down at the gin distillery and I said, right, we're getting a gin, we've tried this one. they are very recently opened, and they have a lot of mountain biking folks down there because it's on the Mogo mountain biking area.
Look, I would say that this is a superb gin and well worthy of any gin drinker's interest and attention. And I have drunk gin from new gin distilleries. That is, it tastes like rum. It tastes like coconut. This doesn't. This tastes like gin with a hint of mandarin. This is a good gin. Well done, Rob. Huzzah!
Huzzah!
Yeah.
We might have some more afterwards, because I have some other gins. We're going to do a gin flight, but we'll see how it goes. See how far we get. So this one's 42%. I think it was an expensive bottle. I made the missus paid for that. About $85 or something for a 700ml bottle.
Look, bespoke gin is expensive. The thing is, we have a lot of younger viewers of the show who are just, they've figured out beer and, huzzah for beer. We love it. But gin, when you get to be an older alcoholic, functional alcoholic.
Functional.
Gin,
one day a month, that's all we drink.
Yeah,
one day a month. That's all we have when we do the podcast.
Yeah. So, but the point is, the gin becomes more attractive to you as you age as a drinker. But as
I said, it's a galactic drink, so that's why it's the GT. Right.
Tasman has noted that Churchill might drink that a lot. And I would also say Churchill very famously, Paul Roger, the French champagne makers, still have a black border on their labels to commemorate that Winston is no longer with them because he drank so much of their champagne.
Wow, okay, there you go. He's like the rock of the cod industry, eh?
Yeah.
Anyway.
All right, we have more gins to come, so we're going to need to drink these while we still talk. But
we can do that. Yes. Don't worry, we can drink gin and talk. So, Ozarmafest.
It's not far away now, Ozarmafest 2025. So if people are thinking of coming from far away, they probably should have booked their plane tickets and their tickets. But we're still saying, come along, we're going to have a great deal of fun, and we're all going to hang out and ride tanks and drink beer, and maybe
wine,
some gin.
And gin. Yeah. I'm going to drink some wine as well, but after the beer drinking, because I can't drink beer all day and all night, whereas I can drink. Yeah, anyway.
It's the end of August, and if you haven't made plans yet, come along. It's going to be great.
We're going to have an awesome time. Somebody else is going to be driving us around, so we can drink as much as we like. But we will endeavour to measure the inside of the barrel of the T72 as requested by
Al reckons it's not 125.
So I'll take a tape measure.
We're going to check it out.
And we'll ask Kurt whether or not we're allowed to do this sort of stuff, and I'm sure he'll say yes. Because anyway, the Australian Abrams spotted leaving Puckapunyal.
Yeah, so a friend of the show texted us that they had been driving near Puckapunyal and seen a bunch of Australian Abrams being transported, and the important criteria here is they were in black and green camouflage, and Australian camouflage always has tan in it because of our landscape.
Or pink.
Well, the tan can be pinkish. But
yes, the tan can be pinkish.
But if it's black and green, that is a Ukrainian camouflage scheme, and that suggests that the Australian Abrams are on the move to Ukraine.
Which we've been talking about for a number of months, and nobody's actually seen any movement. So, but the politicians in Canberra here have been talking about it a lot, but we haven't actually seen them leaving. So,
but the bigger issue is apparently the Americans are extremely annoyed that we are providing these, because it does highlight the fact they have 3,000 Abrams in storage that they're not giving to Ukraine. So there's a bunch of stuff going on there, but let's keep.
There are issues happening between the US and Australian alliance at the moment, and this is just another one of them. All right.
No, I think the teleprompter's done, Rob, so we're going to have to do this off the top of our heads. It's,
Is the batteries flat?
Yeah.
Wow, okay, all right. Yeah. So for the poor young fellas who, and I'm assuming they'll be young fellas, who are going to have to escort these Abrams across from the Port of Melbourne to Poland, they'll have to be sitting on board the ship carrying them and making sure that nobody sea pirates come along and take their Abrams booty. It's going to be a pretty boring trip for them, but I'm sure they'll be paid well, and hopefully they'll get a bit of time off in Europe when they get to the end of it after they deliver them to Poland. So I'm thinking about them.
There's nothing an Australian soldier cares about more than whether they get a trip allowance. That is
having time off. Having time off at the end of it is, if they had to get back on board a plane from a military airfield in Germany and fly straight back to Australia, they'd probably be pretty annoyed. But anyway, we're gonna have to look at the screen to see what's going on.
No, we are. So the slaughter of the
of the
slaughter of the bombers,
the slaughter of the Soviet planes by the Ukrainian drones. That was a masterstroke. 18 months in the planning, executed very well, and took out a third of the fleet of strategic nuclear bombers that the Russians had placed thousands of kilometers all around Russia, so to make sure that nobody could actually blow them up. But guess what? Bit of time, planning, and ingenuity, and they did.
So I think there's a really important issue here for every country in the world, which is that every strategic resource you have needs to have a short-range air defense plan. And it needs to be running all the time, and it needs to be tested at least monthly with someone trying to drive an FPV drone into it and just making sure it works.
Build a hangar. A secure hangar that you can put over the top of it.
There is an issue. The Russian Strategic Bomber Force is...
what happened to ice?
I'm sorry, Rob was looking for the ice. It's so good with you, mate. The Russian Strategic Bomber Force has got strategic arms limitation treaty issues that require it to be out in the public. Rob's found where the ice is, and it wasn't near him. So the strategic arms limitation treaties are why the Russians had to have the planes out in the open. And they couldn't have hard stands.
It makes it easier for them to count how many strategic bombers they have. They don't have to have them out in the open, but they just chose to because it's much cheaper and quicker for them to count if they do it that way. Now, we are now going to the Japanese yuzu and mandarin.
Another mandarin gin. I mean, I've never had a
yuzu
and mandarin, but I've never had a mandarin gin before this moment.
I got to say, yuzu is very, very tasty. It's a
yuzu is
Japanese plum.
Is a Japanese? No, it's a citrus. It's not a plum.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
They're basically oranges.
The missus keeps telling me it's a plum.
No, anyway. your missus is
very clever and wonderful, but obviously she's wrong about this. But that's okay because I can be right about so many things and still be wrong about things. All right. Yeah. So we're going to try another. This one, yuzu and mandarin.
Yep. So the point is that the short-range air defense is going to be essential for every country in the world in every important location. If you've got a dam that you don't want some other bugger blowing up, you are going to need a short-range air defense system. It could just be a Gepard, but you need something that's got a radar that can go from there.
All right.
Rob reckons he's got the teleprompter working. But
it's got the magic touch, obviously. Okay. The US has started a review of the AUKUS submarine deal. The week after, Australia said, you know what? We don't want to spend more money on defence by buying even more US military equipment. It sounds like a bit like a protection racket to me. It's like, nice submarine you got there. Shame, it'd be a real shame if something were to happen to that contract. But in reality, it would be the best thing for Australia. Let's go buy some nice Japanese subs and destroyers. The Japanese destroyers are visiting Australia right now saying, wouldn't you like to buy one of these? These ones work really well. We've got these ones. We can build these ones. We can do all these things.
Now, the Japanese have, and we're way into ships here, but let's dive down for a bit. Japanese have an article in the US Naval Institute Journal Proceedings just in the last couple of months where they're like, we really need Australia to buy Megami-class frigates. So when the Chinese completely obliterate all of our fleet bases in Yokohama and around Japan, we can still keep them in the fight with the Australian facilities.
That sounds like a great plan to me. Somebody is thinking ahead. Somebody is looking to do what should be done.
Yeah.
Right. And look, I couldn't...
But we get to the point that, if we're assuming that all of Japan is going to be obliterated, what sort of conflict are we actually planning for, and do we want that to be...
How do we feel about it? I really like this. Is this better than the Mandarin gin?
I don't know if it's better, but it's really good.
It is really good, isn't it? All right.
Tell everyone what we're drinking again, Rob.
We are drinking the Mandarin Hay Smith's Japanese yuzu and Mandarin flavored gin.
Yeah, see, the yuzu with its extreme bitterness is what makes this gin really
Kampai is what they say. This is only 40%. Yes.
Okay.
So, expertly crafted.
Let's keep rolling.
All right. So let's go buy some nice Japanese and subs and destroyers. I couldn't find the article again, but sure, it was Dr. Albert Palazzo, who we'll probably be talking to next month, stating that Japan builds the third most ships per annum, 40, after South Korea, which is 50 per annum, and China, 1,000 ships per annum.
But the issue here is that North Asia does heavy industry. People who run heavy industry in North Asia say, you know what, I am going to pay people to do heavy industry stuff. I'm going to pay them to weld things together. And in the Western world, we are overly financialized, and no one actually makes decent money or can afford a house by doing things like welding steel plates together. And this is why the future belongs to North Asia and not to the overly financialized Western countries.
Because Western countries don't actually build anything anymore. They just do...
Send designs to China to make.
Yeah, they just move money around. All right. And the US builds 5 ships a year. 5. China's doing 1,000. They're building 5. I mean, out of those 4 choices, essentially, what's our least worst option? Japan. I think I'd rather go with Japan.
In terms of geostrategy, we need to, and this is going to be incredibly hard, make Japan talk to Korea, because they hate each other in deep reasons for good reasons.
It's done again.
Yeah, I know. It's gone. We just need to work on this. So the US review of AUKUS seems like a bit of a kick in the guts, because we said we weren't going to spend more money on American weapons. But we don't actually think AUKUS will ever deliver American submarines to Australia. We've said that for years. Yeah.
As soon as it was announced, saying, when John and I are never seeing these subs in our lifetime. They are never going to turn up with an Australian flag on them. But the subs might turn up, but they will have an American or British flag over the top of them. They will never be crewed by Australians. They might have Australian people on them, but Australia will never have the sovereignty of these subs. And that's a bit sad when Australia's spending $368 billion over the next 40 years to buy them. So we are propping up other countries' industries and wealth. Now, it's just a transfer of wealth.
Now, our next very exciting issue is the big parade, the President's Birthday Parade.
The No King's Day.
For No King's Day, which is happening, by the time you guys see this, it's already happening.
As I said, 14th of June here in Australia is No King's Day in America in about another 16 hours. But the point is, we had our real King's Day last weekend. And you know what? We really enjoyed it, because we decided back in 2001, we had a referendum here in Australia. We were going to keep the monarchy. And the Queen was back then happy about that.
Well, she was thrilled to win her first election.
She was.
Yeah.
And Australia decided that's what we wanted. And because we don't trust politicians. But America is going down that path and going, well, good luck with that, because we at least made a choice. So we had a choice about our Sovereign's Day last weekend.
And our sovereign has extremely limited powers, is the thing to remind. Whereas Mr. Trump is doing something different. Rob, we're done with the battery on that thing. Just leave it.
It's still moving. It's still moving.
Okay. So before we finish up,
but he hasn't declared martial law yet, and unless John's buddy little phone watch thing has told us that martial law is being declared, so we're expecting it anyway. Because let's face it, everything he's doing is leading up to the idea of declare martial law, and because I still want to ask the question, what is happening in America to ensure there will be elections next November 2026 and November 2028. I don't know if there's going to be elections then. That'd be nice to have. No, but who knows?
Look, I'm going to throw some things out here that some people aren't going to like. One of them is when you see Mexican flags being waved in the streets of Los Angeles, I am willing to bet an enormous amount of money to anyone who wants to take the counter bet that in 20 years' time, it's going to turn out that at least one of those Mexican flag wavers was a American government employee.
Just for those folks who don't know, California used to be part of Mexico.
Yeah. That is worth noting. But the bigger point is that infiltration of protests and creation of violence in those protests has been a extremely established modus operandi of American security forces. They do this all the time. They've done this all the time.
If you want to get the reaction you want, then you need to provoke the activities that you want. And to do that, I mean, we saw it in Andor. For those who haven't watched Andor,
watch Andor.
Brilliant season 2. Well done. No notes. It's so good. Good.
But it's all about how fascism works.
Yeah. How you have the meetings to decide, okay, we're going to kill these many people. We're going to do these things, and we're not going to care about it because that's what we want to achieve, the outcomes we want to. We don't care. Which gets us to Israel and the US are sad after sane countries, Australia, Norway, Canada, UK, decided to apply sanctions to 2 Israeli ministers. 2 ministers, that's all, who have stated...
But it was Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the most evil human beings who have existed since the Third Reich.
Who have
sue me for defamation, dudes. Come on. I'm here for it. I got no money, but do it.
Who have stated they want to get rid of all the Palestinians. They don't care if they're starved, bombed, burned, or displaced. They just want to get rid of them from the areas that they want to have the Jewish people occupying rather than Palestinians.
So before we go, I did have one little story about Trenchard has a story about nuclear craters for stopping tanks. And it's really fun because it turns out that if you just have soft ground and you explode your nuclear bomb at ground level, tanks can go in one side, out the other, they're fine. But if you go deeper into the ground before you explode your nuclear weapon, the tanks can't get up out the other side. And I thought that was fun. But the bigger point is that rocky ground is where the nuclear weapon really stuffs up the tanks. So these are things that are worth knowing, and we're done with those.
Rob, no.
Yeah.
Tolkien.
J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yes. The man, the myth, the elfin speaker himself.
Yes.
Stated that he did not want whose cars coming through his town?
William Morris.
And he wrote a story about the devil that was William Morris.
The demonic, evil William Morris. And the funny thing is, so this podcast has been pretty much alone in the world talking about how William Morris was a bad bastard. And there is coming out in the next couple of months a short story that the Tolkien estate has dug up where he just says William Morris is a dark lord of evil. And we have been...
there is a dark lord of evil and who has motorized evil corrupting his town. And there is connections between Tolkien and Morris wanting to have his cars being able to go through Oxford, and Tolkien saying, well, no, Oxford is a town for people and pedestrians, not these horrible machines back in the 60s. Back in the 60s, so it was prior to either, I mean, it was when it was happening. But
the bigger point is that we have been slaving away here talking about how William Morris is a bastard, and the ghost of J.R.R. Tolkien has risen from the frickin' grave with a steel chair to beat William Morris on the back of the head. and
Still chair or glam drink?
Yeah, well, we don't still chair or glam drink, whatever. But he is just Tolkien has joined us to whack this bastard. So we're going to take that. And on that note, Rob, I think
we're just going to give the teleprompter one last go. Just keep on going.
All right.
Well, Iran and Israel, last 24 hours. Who knows where that will end up?
Yeah.
We don't know. All right. Last 24 hours, Iran and Israel have been throwing bombs at each other. And look, I'm really hoping we don't go into World War III in the next 2 weeks. So, thanks to Sean for bringing the J.R.R. Tolkien story to us.
Yes, thank you, Sean.
But it's going to be a difficult time the next couple of weeks. But folks, we're planning to be here in another month. We'll be talking to Al Palazzo. He's got a new book out, and we're on about how Australia can make itself more resilient for the future for defence of Australia, and without AUKUS submarines that we're never going to get. And we're hopeful about that. And we're really hoping the Australian Abrams at some stage make it to Ukraine and actually make a difference there. Mm-hmm. And with that said, I think we do have one last gin, but we haven't gotten through the yuzu gin yet. It is the Kherson. I've spoken about it before. It's the Kherson watermelon gin.
Yeah, the watermelon gin's good gin. So,
it is good gin.
So give it a go.
So it's Liberation gin. We will be having that later on as we watch the Brumbies defeat those nasty Waikato Chiefs, even though they're a damn good rugby team.
It seems unlikely, but we're hopeful. And
we are hopeful. And as I said, James Dolman is not refereeing that game, so we might have a chance. But otherwise, thank you all very much, and we'll talk to you next month at some stage or another, hopefully when the world is still here.
TotallyTank.net. Get on it.
Cheers.